No, no, no. It's John J. Parker, not Barker. Parker with a P. Well, the reason why I decided to write this book was because I wanted to learn more about an important event in American history that hasn't been written about as much as some other similar events that have occurred. In this case, John J. Parker's 1930 nomination to the Supreme Court by Herbert Hoover. Typically, when we think of nominations to the Supreme Court that have been rejected by the Senate, we think of Robert Bork's in 1987, where he was rejected because of mainly ideological reasons, but there were some political reasons as well. In Parker's case, his nomination failed for a few reasons. Civil rights groups were alarmed by a comment that he had made during his 1920 gubernatorial election in North Carolina, where he said that he didn't want black voters to support him and that he didn't think black people should be involved in the political process. You know, not a very controversial statement for a politician back then, especially in the South. But for civil rights groups, they were concerned that this represented who he was, and they were worried that he would bring these views with him to the Supreme Court if he managed to make it that far. Same thing happened with organized labor. They saw a decision that he handed down as a circuit court judge, a decision that Parker believed was required by the law and by existing case law and precedent. He upheld a injunction against union officials from organizing workers at a West Virginia coal mine. This, the workers had signed the so-called yellow dog contract where they agreed not to unionize. And organized labor, they equated these contracts to legalized slavery, and they were alarmed and aghast that a judge would, uphold an injunction forbidding them from doing something that they thought was necessary. And so, like civil rights groups, they were concerned that Parker would bring these views with him to the court. And this tied into sort of the larger debate concerning the Supreme Court at the time. A lot of people felt that the Supreme Court over the previous few decades had been very pro business, had been much more concerned about the rights of corporations and companies and wealthy business owners as opposed to employees, individual workers, and laborers, the people doing the work. Meanwhile, civil rights groups had long felt that the Supreme Court had shirked its duties to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to protect Black Americans and minorities. And so they were concerned that putting Parker on the bench would set the course of progress back even more. And then, there were also political reasons too, as there are with any Supreme Court nomination. There were powerful senators who had certain agendas. The president had his own agenda. There are partisan considerations at play, sort of the future of whether or not the South would stay Democratic. So what ended up happening was you had a sort of a perfect storm of events that took him down. Well, I wouldn't want to get in the way of your very important barking time at rabbits, so do what you got to do. Um, in the meantime, the writing process for this book was very similar to the one for my last book, Nixon in New York, How Wall Street Helped Richard Nixon Win the White House. In that book, there was, again, a topic that I wanted to learn more about that I thought wasn't very well covered. In this case, Richard Nixon's law firm career on Wall Street and how that helped him prepare for the 1968 presidential election. So when it came to Parker, once I learned more about the circumstances that led to his rejection, and I learned more about it, I decided, you know what, maybe it's time that I write about it. So that was really just the start of it. And there were 8 years between those two books, but obviously I wasn't spending the whole time working on this book. In fact, actually, what took up the most time was the mental battle, as far as first deciding, do I even want to write another book? Like, do I want to get on that horse again? It's a big commitment. What if it doesn't work out? What if it doesn't go where I want, where I think it will go, or where I want it to go? What if it doesn't do well? What if people don't like it? So once you kind of get past the doubts in your head and you decide, okay, I want to do this, I'm committed to it. Then the next thing that for me was the next mental hurdle was, okay, how am I going to do this? Um, so that took a long time as far as like figuring out, okay, this is how I want to structure the book. This is how I'm going to do the research. This is how I'm going to write it. This is the time period that I'm going to commit to. Um, and once I kind of worked all that out of my mind, that took a while. Like that probably took probably a few years. In the meantime, I'm starting to gather some research. I'm starting to do some preliminary work into it as well. But then once I kind of kicked it into high gear and decided, okay, I'm going to do this, then it was all about setting a timeline for myself. Like I wanted to have the first draft done by Christmas. I wanted to have the second draft done by, Valentine's Day, around there. And so you kind of come up with these, artificial timelines these artificial goalposts for yourself, but you stick to them. And once you kind of get used to the schedule and kind of force yourself to kind of do a little bit whenever you can, I found that it was very that part didn't take nearly as long as um, the mental battle starting out, as far as do I even want to do this and how am I going to do this? So that was how it went for this book, and ultimately, maybe that's just how I work. It's very similar to the Nixon book. Oh, how'd you get there? Anyway, I think there are a couple of reasons. Uh, First of all, there's recency. Bork was the one that most people remember, the one that we lived through, the one that kind of formed an indelible memory for a lot of us. And a big reason was because he showed up. He confronted the Judiciary Committee. He defended his views. He went after his detractors. And so there's that sort of heavyweight aspect, that mano a mano fight. Like, I'm going to show up and I'm going to defend myself and I'm going to try to change your minds. And we remember things like that. Like those kind of things stick in our minds. That was the case with Thomas too, and the thing with Kavanaugh. We remember these confrontations when they happen, and even when it's a more positive interaction, like Roberts when he went before the committee and charmed them by talking about how judges were there to call balls and strikes and not playing the game. These are things that we remember, and things that stick in our minds. With Parker, we don't have that. For one thing, it was 1930. Television had just been invented, and it certainly wasn't readily available in people's homes. And even if it were, they wouldn't have seen anything because Parker didn't show up to the Judiciary Committee to confront his detractors and talk about his views and defend himself. Back then, it was expected for nominees not to show up. That was the precedent. In fact, only Harlan Fiske Stone before Parker had bothered to show up before the committee at all, and that was because his nomination ran into some problems, and he showed up to defend himself and to confront his detractors, and ultimately it worked out for him, and he was confirmed. Parker actually goes into some of this with his surrogates. He wrestles kind of back and forth as to whether or not he should show up and do the same thing that Stone did, defend himself, confront his detractors, and explain his views and things like that. But the other part of it was that as a judge and as a judicial nominee, he felt like he needed to kind of stay above the fray and not actively campaign for a judge, not actively campaign for a job, not make his views known because otherwise that could potentially compromise his ability to rule on things going forward. And so that instinct of being a judge first and a political appointee second, that ended up making the decision for him not to show up. So I think as a result of that, we don't have that kind of same confrontation between him and the senators on the committee, or even later on. So I think that's a big reason why. I mean, ultimately this battle played out in the newspapers and not on the airwaves. Yeah, give that intern a raise, whoever it is. Anyway, there are a few precedents when it comes to what happened with Parker. I mean, judges love precedents, right? John Rutledge made a statement that ended up being used against him, a political statement. In his case, he spoke out against the treaty that was negotiated by John Jay, his predecessor as Chief Justice. And he harshly criticized the treaty, really went after it, and the newspaper recorded his words. They got widely disseminated, and his own party, the Federalists, were so embarrassed and upset by it that they ended up rejecting him. So that showed that was sort of the first indication that someone's political views could be used against them when it came time to being nominated for the Supreme Court. Another precedent was Stanley Matthews. He was nominated to the court in 1881 by President Rutherford B. Hayes. and his nomination engendered a lot of controversy and opposition. Grassroots organizations organized against the Supreme Court nominee for the very first time to oppose Matthews because they didn't like his work that he had done for the railroad industry. And ultimately, he was able to squeak by. He won by one vote. So that obviously had a lot of repercussions for Parker because now groups knew that they could put pressure on the situation. They could make their opposition known, and they knew that they could have an impact on things. And then the other aspect with Parker that you have to consider was that there were powerful senators who opposed him. In his case, they were led by William Borah of Idaho and George Norris of Nebraska. They were very prominent progressives in the Senate who very frequently went against their own party. They were Republicans, although and Norris later was an independent for a little while. They were very pro. They were very pro labor. They were very concerned about the direction of the Supreme Court over the previous few decades and how pro corporate or how pro business it was, and they wanted things to change. They hated yellow dog contracts. They were concerned about the plight of the laborers. They wanted to protect them, and they didn't want business as usual, so to speak. And to them, Parker represented that. So this confluence of events is what made Parker so unique because in the past you would see instances where you had like one senator or a group of senators derail one nominee, or you had grassroots organizations taking on another nominee, or you had controversial statements being used against a, another nominee. But in this case, all of that came to bear with Parker, and like I said, it set off a perfect storm that took him down. Yeah, that thing's good to you. Well, I guess to each their own. Well, I think what the fight has shown is that grassroots groups are no longer going to be content just being part of the process or even sitting on the sidelines. They were going to now be the ones calling the shots, being the drivers, um, whether that be on the liberal side or the conservative side or whatnot. If there's a nominee that they're opposed to that is goes against one of their core principles, and they're not going to just sit by and let the process take its natural path. They're going to get involved, and in some cases, they're going to be the ones leading the charge. And so we've seen that in pretty much every single confirmation battle since then. Most notably, in 1969, 1970, Richard Nixon tried to appoint Clement Haynsworth and then G. Harold Carswell to a seat that was vacated by Abe Fortas under ethical concerns. And both those guys got rejected by the Senate. And both those times, it was the same forces that organized against Parker were the ones that organized against Haynsworth and then Carswell. You had labor and you had civil rights groups decided to run it back, and they decided to get the band back together for another run, and they were successful. They took both those guys down, and that's how we end up with Harry Blackmun, who was sort of the consensus candidate after those two. And ever since then, interest groups have just been part of the process, for, against, whatever. We've seen that with every single candidate since then, and that'll probably be the case for every single candidate in the future. And that's understandable in a lot of ways because these groups have very strong beliefs. They have a very committed membership, and they have a very vested interest in how these cases are going to be decided, cases that are of great importance to them. And they're not going to sit by and let history happen. They're going to try and shape it. And I really think that is the ultimate legacy of the Parker fight. You know, in today's vernacular, whenever somebody gets rejected for ideological reasons or political reasons or whatnot, we say they got borked, right? They tried to bork this guy. They tried to bork this judge. They tried to bork this person. They did bork this person. Well, this book makes the case that maybe it should be Parkered, not borked. After all, Bork got Parkered, as did Hainsworth, as did Carswell, as did Fortas. And all those factors that were at play for those confirmation battles and the ones that came afterward, those were all seen for the very first time in the Parker fight, all those factors coming together as one. And so that really, I think, is the ultimate legacy of the Parker fight. Wow, hard work, huh? Anyway, I think what really surprised me about learning about Parker during this whole process was to realize that he was actually a very influential and consequential figure in American jurisprudence, and one that hasn't really been remembered as such. And actually, this book makes the case that he might have been less powerful and less influential had he actually been on the Supreme Court. And the reason for that is that during the Brown versus the Board of Education cases, when they came up before the Supreme Court, he was one of the circuit judges on the case of Briggs versus Elliott, which was a South Carolina case filed by the NAACP challenging segregation of public schools. In a bunch of those cases, they got captioned into Brown versus Board of Education, with that as the lead case. And so Parker had written an opinion saying that public school segregation was constitutional under the law, citing all kinds of precedent, Plessy versus Ferguson and whatnot, separate but equal. Obviously, then the case goes up to the Supreme Court, and they hand down a decision, a very famous decision, striking down public school segregation and calling it inherently unequal and saying that it has no place in public education. The case then goes back to Parker to decide how to implement in his jurisdiction, and then he comes up with a very influential opinion that's copied and followed by many, many judges and politicians. What he says is that Brown versus the Board of Education only outlaws segregation in public schools. It does not mandate integration. It does not mandate race mixing. It just says that government entities cannot enforce segregation. And so this ends up leading to all kinds of delay tactics, all kinds of ways for local school boards and states and cities to try to get around the decision. School choice plans, privatizations, and things of those nature. To the point that this doctrine ended up being called the Parker Doctrine, and it was cited by judges and lawyers, all across the country. And obviously, it wasn't just a Southern thing, but it was very prevalent in the South. And one historian ended up saying that this was probably the biggest organized resistance by the South since the Civil War. And so, they had John J. Parker to thank for that. So the reason why I said that, he ended up being more influential by being rejected by the Supreme Court is that if he had been on the Supreme Court and he would have been one of the judges that heard the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And even if he had stuck to his guns and said, you know what, public school segregation is a way of life, Plessy is still good law, I'm not gonna sign on to Earl Warren's opinion, blah blah blah, he would have just been one justice. And chances are, it would have been an 8-1 decision, or maybe Earl Warren would have twisted his arm in the way he was very, very talented at, and gotten Parker to go along for the good of the country, and really kind of neutered his influence, so to speak. So, he ended up having more of an influence on things because he was quote unquote stuck on the circuit court as opposed to being one of the 9 justices. So that was very surprising to me to learn because I'd never known any of that. And so learning that was definitely an eye opener for me. And also there are some other things that I was surprised about too, to learn that he never really gave up his dream of being on the Supreme Court. He still would kind of subtly campaign for spots whenever they came open, and he was still considered for seats going forward because it wasn't like he got rejected for being incompetent or being unqualified or whatnot. That was never the case. It was just political reasons and ideological reasons and whatnot. So really, yeah, that was the most surprising thing that I found out, was that he was much more influential and consequential than I even knew about. It was kind of like Star Wars, like you strike me down and I shall become more powerful than you can ever imagine. Although I don't think he said that during the confirmation battle. Ugh, looks like she's asleep. Hopefully, this book will not put you to sleep. That's Supreme Pressure, The Rejection of John J. Parker and Birth of the Modern Supreme Court Confirmation Process by Victor Lee. Published by Palgrave Macmillan. Available however you get your books. Amazon, Apple iBooks, whatever. Also, you can request it at your local library. In fact, that's probably the best way to do it. And if you are a subscriber to Springer Nature Link, it is available as a free downloadable ebook, so feel free to try that as well. In the meantime, thank you for having me, and I appreciate it being able to talk about my book.